transition smoothly. A bit of characterization then. These are liberal university students as organizers who opposed the Hasina's authoritarian rule. Specifically, they were opposed to the spoils system that gave jobs and social benefits to the descendants of people involved in the 1971 Liberation War. They took the cause to the streets recently, the national military cracked down, and therefore the government has been overthrown ever since. First argument then, democratic consolidation. The goal of this debate is on OG, we want a stable transition to democracy. Context, Bangladesh is at an extremely enormously pivotal and fragile moment of transition. This is a post-revolutionary state. The military still has huge amounts of influence and large fractions of the military still have ties to the fallen Hasina government. On top of this, Bangladesh is also a relatively impoverished country with high levels of ethnic and religious divisions and tensions. Therefore, there are a lot of instability that's currently brewing within the region. What then happens when student organizers directly run for political roles? We say this is quite bad for a couple of reasons. One, it actively reduces buy-in to the prospect of a future democratic government, especially the perception of it, which often impacts how it plays out in the long run. Why? Because often you still have religious conservatives and rural populations in Bangladesh, and on top of that, people and supporters with loyalties to the old regime who are deeply skeptical of these people running for office. Why? The specific concern with this crowd of student organizers running is that it alienates a substantial amount of people who fear that these student organizers are not striving for a truly democratic government, but instead just authoritarianism run by the opposition party of they themselves instead. What is the impact of this mechanism? This often means that there is likely going to be less buy-in for institutions, i.e., for example, people don't pay as much taxes, and that's a big problem for Bangladesh right now, by the way. Or second, it is easy for radical opposition parties to characterize student-led parties or governments as radical and violent. If you view these parties as radical and violent, you are more likely to vote for a radical ultra-nationalist or Islamist party, and you often do things like exacerbate ethno-nationalism in politics and you actively bring more instability. Second, this is also bad because it reduces electoral competition. How does this actually happen? Because many people involved in the protests, many people involved in these protests are almost assuredly going to vote for these student leaders when they run. Why is this the case? Because often they have already built cults of personality when organizing these revolutions. They often have a good amount of charisma, which is what allowed them to organically rise to the top of these revolutions in the first place, and there is a track record of their efforts and their success. And, most importantly, these leaders are also likely to run in the same party or same government to actively capitalize on the July Revolution support, which is unprecedentedly large compared to any efforts they have made in the past. Why is this terrible then? Because this actively increases the fear of further democratic backsliding. If you are already a person on the fence and skeptical of the revolution, when there is landslide support for these figures that cannot really be challenged in any meaningful way, because the AL government and their credibility is down the drain, you fear they become the next Hasina, even if they never end up like that. Because this is a comparative argument. Why? Because in the counterfactual, there are still going to be parties that run to appeal to these protesters, but there are going to likely be more competing parties and political figures because they cannot all unite under the silver bullet that we took down the AL government. They often have to do so much more to differentiate themselves and to make sure they are passive or they are proposing real policy. But also, second, these leaders face less political accountability on their side. The students who led the protests are, while very admirable people, no, not actually infallible. Power tends to corrupt even when there are good intentions in some cases. When you give large amounts of power to a small group, they often have selfish incentives to engage in things like ethnic favoritism, because you may view that you need some level of majority support to make sure that you can stay in government for a bit to pass the policies and ideals you want to pass, because you genuinely believe ideologically these are good policies and you want to help the Bangladeshi people. You often sometimes might engage in corruption because you believe if there's no way out to get funds besides actively pandering to the military in some case, even if you think that these are all done for good causes, this often leads to democratic backsliding even when intentions are not harmful. Often I say that, no, but these leaders are good. We agree, they're probably good, but when they get into power, they oftentimes change, and we argue that change is likely, especially in these circumstances of large amounts of instability. But third, what this means is that leaders cannot be held accountable to the ballot box, and this is no longer that different from the old regime. This is terrible. The counterfactual is, we likely think there is a multiplicity of parties and leaders are likely going to contest in these elections. Student leaders likely support a variety of parties. Political competition is good. Why? Because you often have to pander to more groups, more minorities, it's harder for you to alienate them. You often prevent backsliding and they hold each other accountable, which is crucial in a moment of democratic transition. Second argument, before that closing.
Yeah, so if the anti-discrimination students movement doesn't run, what other force has the institutional capacity to form a party? Or is it just going to be lots of sort of small independent groups of
Well, I mean, I think this is a question to be answered in the round. I'm not exactly sure right now. Ryan will do it. Second argument, this reduces immediate political instability. It is not even clear that we will get elections or when we will get elections. So therefore, we need stability to make sure the transitional government at least works in the interim, because these are lives of people at stake. There's like families to feed and there's people we need to house. Why does this actively benefit the transitional government then? Because here's the comparative. It is far more likely they get a military coup on opposition. The way you should weigh this argument is that even if this happens like 30% more likely, that is a huge risk we would not wish to take, because often that leads to blood on the streets. Often that means that people's livelihoods are destroyed and you lose faith in democracy, which ends up being irreversible on their side. The military currently is very powerful in Bangladesh for a host of reasons. They've always been given huge levels of control of the Bangladeshi economy since the Cold War. They're politically influential because of connections to political parties. Problem, when the military backs the interim government, but they have qualms with the leaders of protest movements. Why? They do not want the leaders of protest movements involved, because the leaders specifically are people and icons and figureheads of the anti-military movement then, when they were fighting in the revolution. When student organizers began running for office, you view democracy as a threat to your continuous grasp of power, and this is a perception issue on their side. The counterfactual by no means is perfect on our side. The student protesters are more able to portray democracy as good for the military. They can better ally with the military, or at least not go directly against it. And even if it's not a coup on our side, they still undermine elections. There's more violence against protesters, and that's all on that. Far worse. Very proud to propose.
We thank the Speaker very much for their speech, and we now welcome the Leader of Opposition to begin the opposition case. Hear, hear.
So we're going to explain two simple things in opening opposition. First, why leadership is better. Secondly, why the world in which these student leaders engage outside the democratic system is far worse. I'm going to prove how we get the stability that OG thinks is so important, as well as better policies. So firstly, why don't we just get better leadership within the system? So we agree with the premise of opening government that these student leaders are likely to win because they're often uniquely inspiring. Many people supported the movement in the first place in order to overthrow the dictatorship, indicating a large amount of support. The current leader of the provisional government, Muhammad Yunus, is likely to back these individuals as well. They're just generally relatable to youth and uniquely inspiring because they represented the movement that gave them democracy, was pushing to give them democracy, that represented the fall of the dictatorship that oppressed so many individuals. Why is this so good? I have a couple of reasons why people make better leaders that are uniquely able to represent the youth and make their voices important in the political sphere in the first place. And the premise here directly challenges what we get at an opening government that says there will be incentives to represent the youth on either side of the house. If we prove that youth otherwise will be politically disengaged, this means there's less political incentives to cater to them because you don't see them as viable votes to uphold in the first place. Why is this the case? Firstly, youth deeply distrust the establishment, not only due to decades of oppression under a dictatorship, or a pseudo-dictatorship, and a legacy of corruption associated with other parties like the BNP as well, but also you just generally associate the state itself as a source of repression. But also structurally, youth often have incentives to engage in rational ignorance, where you believe that your vote doesn't matter and you have less incentive therefore to be politically engaged, because it's not worth it to put in the efforts to vote and to try and learn about political parties if you don't think your vote's going to matter in the first place. And even when you do consume media, it often feeds you negative narratives about, like, for example, why democracy is a sham, why horrible things in your country are happening. It's not worth voting because media often sensationalizes the worst things that happen because it's the most eye-catching. Which means youth that often disproportionately feel these things often have no incentives to want to engage politically otherwise. So it's uniquely only the leaders that represented the transition to democracy that you are willing to fight for the past that would make you engage in the political system and have some degree of trust to want to vote in the first place. On their side, they have no leverage. The second reason why youth are going to be disproportionately not politically represented is that they're economically weak as well. Where A, this is just likely because youth are quite young, you had less time to accumulate wealth in the long term, which gives you political and economic leverage. So this time itself hurts. But secondly, Bangladesh is currently going through an economic transition where they're going from a relatively poor to a more like middle and upper income country, which has resulted in large amounts of unemployment in the short term, because as your country becomes richer, as wages rise, it means that as the economy begins to transition, many people are left behind and left unemployed, and this disproportionately harms the youth because their lack of experience and time means they're not likely to be, for example, like high-skilled, like middle manager type people, and more likely to be workers, which has left many of them economically in the dust. This means that they have often less, for example, lobbying power, but also less economic power to be engaged in the system, as well as take time off to vote as well, and to do things like attend protests, to attend like rallies, especially in the context of a post-revolution society, where a lot of their will to engage and their will to protest has been exhausted as well. This means that in the absence of these individuals, they get no representation for the youth. Why is it up? Furthermore, I want to explain why youth leaders themselves are likely to be incredibly good. This is because there's likely to be a selection effect where the youth leaders are likely to be people that have strong liberal democratic values, but to the extent that they're willing to fight and potentially be incarcerated or die for these values in an oppressive regime in the first place, which suggests a deep ideological attachment to things like democracy and like the liberalization of society. What is the impact of all of this? I think it's firstly just good that we have good democratic liberal values or things like against corruption and pro things like meritocracy, but also on a political policy level, it's good that we have demands to cater to people that have long-term interests, i.e. the youth that are going to live for much longer than people who are not the youth. And this is important because this demands, for example, a transition away from textiles and other forms of low-skilled industry, but which is bad in the long term, even if it is desirable to politicians in the short term. Why are these sorts of things bad in the long term? Things like, for example, textiles or other forms of manufacturing often are unsustainable as Bangladesh becomes more economically wealthy, because as incomes rise, your exports become less competitive, because you have higher costs of inputs, and this is bad because it's harder to outcompete other industries, but also things like automation and the rise of automation would otherwise force these countries like Bangladesh to prematurely deindustrialize as well. So why is it the case that alternatives are bad and are going to care about these short-termist interests? So first, let's begin by characterizing who these alternatives are. So you think firstly it's likely to be, for example, the BNP, which is an old establishment party which is likely to have the resources and the legitimacy to succeed by being an opposition party to the Awami League. And this is a problem because they have a long history of corruption and institutionalized corruption, which is likely to continue because often you, as a leader of a party that is engaged in corruption in the past, are predominantly adapted to have large amounts of wealth as a source, but also B, are likely to be politically short-termist as well. They're likely to have connections with, because as an old establishment party, you have large connections with industry, for example, manufacturing or textiles, which is often the tipping point for you catering to their interests, not only because they have personal connections, but because there's some competing alternative incentives. So, for example, many other workers in society are somewhat short-termist. You want to keep your job in the short term, even if it's bad for the country in the long term. So these two factors in combination are often the tipping point for alternative parties like the BNP to overvalue these short-term and prioritize things like textiles as opposed to adapting and investing in better long-term economic plans. Secondly, I think another alternative is likely to be like Islamist parties as well, because Bangladesh has a large Islamist population, or a Muslim population, which is likely to be incredibly oppressive towards Hindu minorities. And this is likely to be the case because Islamist parties have used this as a primary means of differentiation as a political party against other parties, which is likely to lead to a more extremist type of rhetoric and policy stance. Secondly, I want to explain why it is worse for these leaders to engage outside the political system before that goes.
Yunus has been a powerful democratizing and anti-corruption force, even just since August, and overthrowing Hasina was the cause of the momentum, which can be channeled to and strengthen existing political institutions, which young people now, even if not in the past, have desired to vote for.
Right, but the problem is it's associated with the student leaders alongside Yunus who are seen as a front for like the pro-democracy movement. When they don't run, they're also likely to do things like be critical of the otherwise democratic system, or our parties in the counterfactual, which is what we're going to explain now. In this short run, we think in a world where these people do not run, it leads to more instability, where, for example, these student leaders are more likely to do things like stop protests, because they believe these other alternative parties are bad and anti-democratic, which they're also likely to be, which we proved in our previous point. So they do things like protest on these streets, even if it's not all youth, it's like the leaders and the close followers who now are not choosing to run, but still have the original passion, the desire to be engaged. This is a problem because these types of protests, firstly, lead to things like democratic backsliding and distrust of the government that OG thinks is so harmful, but also creates instability itself, which leads to things like the investor flights. Finally, I think the overwhelming dominance of the students' party that would run on our side is good in terms of avoiding gridlock that occurs more when you have other plurality of parties on their side of the house that are likely to have an overwhelming majority, and gridlock itself is often inherently bad when, for example, like parties have incentives to sabotage the main party in a coalition because they want them to succeed less. They can win in the next electoral cycle, which is really harmful because you don't pass basic infrastructural bills that Bangladesh needs in a post-conflict society. Opposed.
But the AC is switched off here, right? I
is it that we control the people?
Yeah, on the
Hold on.
Maddie, over coming.
Hello, the AC seems to have stopped working. Alejandro? The AC isn't what, yeah, it is.
I found just
Oh, okay, that's fine. So if it goes off, just pay the main. So wait 2 minutes and then reset? Yeah, cool, perfect. Thank you very much, guys. Good. Cool. We thank the speaker very much for their speech, and we now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the Gov case. Here.
If this was WUDC 1980 and the motion was about Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe, all of opening opposition's arguments could be made to the very same extent that the people we need to care the most about are the young revolutionaries involved in the protest movements who need to be represented by their lovely figure Mugabe. We all know how that story ends, hint not well. The thesis of opening government is straightforward. Power corrupts. The student protesters did a good thing by toppling Hasina's regime. The best thing they can now do is to stay on the outside, to criticize, yes, to protest, as opposed to become corrupted by the political establishment. 3 points in this speech. First, on youth voting. Second, the counterfactual. Finally, democratic consolidation. First, on youth establishment. This is opening opposition's main point. I have 4 lines of response. Response number 1. The premise of opening opposition's claim is that the youth are otherwise unlikely to engage in politics. That's unlikely because student organizers don't disappear on our side of the house. They still exist, they still have charisma, they still have cults of personality, and have strong incentives to encourage youth voters to turn out and vote. And the reason why this is probably a message that will be received well by young individuals is for all the reasons that opening opposition themselves name. For example, the fact that these leaders have unique power over student protesters, the fact that these people have charisma, the fact that these individuals are seen as having accomplished the revolutionary movement, which means even if there is a marginal reduction in the youth vote, it's not 60%. Rather, you probably get a high level of youth turnout on either side of the House, mitigating opening opposition's claim. Response number 2. Political parties, most obviously the BNP, have strong structural incentives under our side of the House to appeal towards youth voters. And this is for 3 reasons. Reason number 1, the August protest movement energized youth votes in a way that was not true historically. So opening opposition is right. Historically, young voters in Bangladesh did not participate in democratic politics. But the fact they have now been energized and mobilized by the most powerful moment in post-independence Bangladeshi history means that youth voters probably feel empowered to participate in democratic politics, even if their leaders do not run. Reason number 2, political parties have strong incentives to appeal towards youth voters to deter any potential violence. Hint, what did student protesters do this August when political parties did not represent them? They turned to the streets, they rioted, foreign investment plummeted, which means even if the BNP is corrupt and selfish, its corrupt and selfish interests align with appealing towards youth voters to ensure there is not a second July revolution. Reason number 3, on our side of the House, we have durable fiat to assume these leaders do not suddenly form a political party. But if you're the BNP, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, you're always concerned that if you do not appeal sufficiently well to youth voters, these guys might come out of retirement and actually run against you, which means the theoretical potential that these organizers could potentially run in elections is a powerful preemptive deterrent against neglecting or ignoring the youth vote. Response number 3 to opening opposition. We'll flip their claim. Youth distrust will be worse on their side of the House. This is an argument that applies to the longer-term prospect, not the immediate term. Both teams agree in the short term, the people who participated in the protests vote overwhelmingly for these figures. But what happens in the long term? Student protesters are likely to feel enormously disillusioned with Bangladeshi politics. Why is that? Because when these people become political operators, when they run parties, when they're in government, they have to make decisions and trade-offs that protesters feel violated the principles they push for. These people have to accept campaign contributions from corporations. They have to engage in political horse trading to overcome the gridlock opening opposition describes. Here's the problem. When the person that you saw leading the revolution is now engaging in the very same kinds of political shenaninery that you opposed and you fought against, that is when you are much more likely on their side of the house to feel personally attacked. Now, to be clear, on both sides of the house, some political party has to engage in horse trading, campaign contributions, etc. It's better when that's a mainstream political party like the BNP, as opposed to the figureheads of the movement violating their trust, which flips their claim on engagement long-term and also increases the probability of protests on the streets. This comprehensively flips opening opposition's claim and mitigates it to the point they cannot win on this argument. Point number 2, what is the counterfactual? Opening opposition says that the likely counterfactual is the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. We agree, here's 3 reasons. First, this party has existing infrastructure, they've been in power or been the main opposition movement since its rise to power in 2009. They've been the main secondary party in Bangladesh since the 80s. Reason number 2, the AL is overwhelmingly unlikely to win votes in the upcoming election. Why is that? They've been enormously discredited. Their leader literally fled to, I think, India. The point is that the AL is at an all-time low, which means the BNP has enormous capacity to win the election because they have existing infrastructure. Reason number 3, just empirically, polling shows that the BNP is probably going to be the largest party whatever the next election happens to be. Now, opening opposition's claim here is twofold. First, they say that radical Islamist parties gain power. Second, they say the BNP is bad. Let's work through both. Their first claim on radical Islamist parties doesn't work for 3 reasons. Reason number 1, there's a huge problem with this argument, which is they are right, Islamist parties will get some power. But the groups that are voting for Islamist parties would never be the student protesters on our side of the house. The reason why is that the vast majority of people involved in the student protest movements were liberal, democratic, or university students. They are overwhelmingly secular or not highly religious, which means if the organizers of the protests don't run for office, then the people who would have voted for them are not suddenly turning to radical Islamist parties because they do not believe that as a legitimate conception of democracy. Therefore, the likely alternative is they move towards secular parties, like, for example, the BNP. Response number 2, it's unlikely that Islamist parties gain substantial power because there's a game theoretic disincentive to vote for these parties. The reason why is that you know that the percentage of votes that goes to any individual Islamist party is low, especially because there are multiple of them and they split the vote. So you as a voter have a game theoretic incentive to vote for a secular party that's likely to get a greater share of votes because that's more likely to affect the outcome of an election. Sia.
Why are you drawing a distinction between, why are you saying that the BNP is the secular party? They're clearly the non-secular.
No. So just to be clear, the claim I'm making here is that the radical fundamentalist Islamist parties are not likely to gain power. Our claim is the BNP is preferable. This deals nicely with opening opposition. Second claim, they say the BNP is short-termist and corrupt. A lot of problems here. Response number 1, the BNP can be held accountable on our side of the house with the specific advocacy, criticism, and protesting of powerful organized movements. The BNP has incentives to listen to these people, even if they're not involved in politics, to ensure there is not another wave of revolution. Secondarily, the BNP understands that it has to earn the support of these voters, because these voters, for all the reasons opening opposition identifies, are distrustful of mainstream parties, and legitimately so. So the BNP, unlike a student organizer, cannot take these votes for granted, which means the BNP has strong incentives to rebrand itself, to internally purge corrupt members from its party. But thirdly, and this is critical, we are fine with gridlock. Here's why. Because the biggest problem facing Bangladesh is not that you don't pass policy. The biggest problem facing Bangladesh is that a authoritarian movement gains power, does not have checks on its capacity to legislate, and turns Bangladesh into a secondary authoritarian movement. Gridlock is good because it moderates policy. Even if you have Islamist parties, they are counterbalanced by secular parties. All of which means that it is good to have gridlock on their side of the house to increase the probability of backsliding and military violence we propose. If you want, you can put it on either big thing of paper if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You can keep that chair, maybe. I don't know how much.
I don't think it has.
Yeah, I'm just gonna take mine out of our.
We can do 2 if you want to really snap.
Yeah, yeah.
It's all beautiful.
Alright, you guys good? Yep, cool. I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Paloma Chopra. Yeah.
First, I want to frame out the PM claim on the likelihood of a coup. It's extremely unlikely you'd get a military coup. One, the military lacks funding. FDI is declining. The military cares about funding because democratic institutions actually favor the military. When parties compete against each other in the potential of a democracy, they are also likely to compete for the military's favor, which is why they're likely to give the military funding. However, this depends on having access to foreign investment. Second, the youth movement is a substantial unifying force, and the military doesn't want to go against the entire unifying force of student leaders and the young youth movement. That's why the military chief, Waqar-uz-Zaman, gave concessions to the transitional government under Yunus. This is why the youth movement are specifically less likely to be anti-military after this point, meaning the military struggles to challenge the youth movement. In contrast, the military probably has substantial capacity to challenge the BNP that doesn't have the same degree of legitimacy that the youth movement has. As a consequence, a military coup is, if anything, more likely on their side. Third, there's likely to be Western leverage. Bangladesh is in the middle of a $4.7 billion IMF bailout, and the biggest market for its goods is the EU, which is looking for a trade deal because in 2029, the EU's favorable trade conditions are set to expire, meaning Bangladesh can't export to them. However, the West will not use its leverage against a coup if the BNP is in power. This is because Khaleda Zia's administration was extremely unpopular among the West, precisely for engaging in the same kinds of democratic backsliding as Sheikh Hasina. So a military coup might actually be favorable for China or the West in the presence of the BNP, but not in the presence of a transitional government. So if anything, a military coup is more likely on their side. No, for this flip to work, we don't have to prove that a military coup is more likely than not. The risk of a military coup is a massive detrimental impact to Bangladesh because investors are terrified of military governments and they pull out capital, meaning Bangladesh struggles to transition its economy in expected value terms. This is larger than any of the other impacts in opening government. Let's talk about the plausible alternatives in this debate, beginning with Khaleda Zia's BNP. The first point I want to make is the BNP will not face political competition in the short run. So I think Ryan agrees the BNP will be in power, but critically it will not be held accountable, it will not face political competition, and there's no substantial risk of youth leaders re-entering politics because of how the BNP will establish itself as having an overwhelming advantage in politics. Reason one, they have a leg up in terms of funding. They have name recognition and existing stockpiles of funding, plus large amounts of corruption from being in opposition for a while. This funding is critical to finance electoral campaigns. Here's the thing, youth leaders have a unique moment of legitimacy right now after the July revolution, but people's memories of revolution are short-lived. The reason why is Bangladesh is facing an economic transition. It is at the risk of a foreign exchange crisis, which is why it is experiencing a bailout from the IMF. Youth unemployment is in record highs. What does this mean? It means when the BNP has substantial amounts of funding, youth leaders, if they re-enter politics in a future moment when people experience economic crisis and don't have immediate memories of the July revolution, so they don't just look at a youth leader and automatically think they are good, funding is extremely important in elections. Funding is also important because voting is hard in this economic situation. Liz's argument was not just young people aren't motivated to vote, it's that they don't have the capacity to vote. Because if youth unemployment is high, you don't have the time to take time off work in order to stand in line to vote. This is ours and us, and the BNP probably doesn't want to encourage young voters precisely because, as Ryan's argument concedes, it is scared of them. So the BNP is lucky to make voting specifically hard, the same tactics that the Awami League engaged in, but the youth are terrified to engage in a second protest. The protest already led to massive humanitarian losses. It was the military gunning down protesters. Even if it led to success at the end, the youth are tired of continuing to engage in future protests, so there isn't a substantial risk of a protest. What this means is, young people will struggle to turn out to vote and the BNP's political power is likely to be entrenched because when it is in power, it will continue gaining access to funding by being in power and by being the incumbent party, meaning future political competition is unlikely to threaten it. No thank you. Third, the BNP's existing voter bloc is much less fractured. Historically, people who are worried about Indian intervention in Bangladeshi politics or people with more of an Islamist lean have sided with the BNP and their voter bloc is unlikely to fracture in the future, meaning other political parties will simply be absorbed by the power of the BNP. As a consequence, the BNP is unlikely to face large political competition in their best case that a coup does not happen. Why does this matter? Because the BNP is, first, because it means all the PM's arguments on political competition are gone. Political competition is symmetrical. But second, then we listen to the DPM's arguments on young people and why the BNP will cater to them. First, the BNP will not cater to them. What are the arguments here? One, they say youth voters are energized by the protest. There is an assertion, I've demonstrated there's substantial exhaustion among youth voters after the protest, combined with complacency about Bangladeshi politics because these specific actions of the Awami League, for example, reservations for military members from the 1971 revolution are gone. There is a combination of complacency and exhaustion, which means youth voters aren't energized and aren't as likely to turn out. Their second mechanism is student organizers have credibility and they have incentives to tell them to turn out to vote. Here's the problem. Youth leaders are likely to back the BNP. Why is this likely to be true in the absence of them coming into positions of power? Because the BNP has bested by Sheikh Hasina, which means they're able to use the rhetoric of saying, we are the BNP, the party that was persecuted by the Awami League. This power gives us substantial amounts of influence among young voters. So if the initial involvement and endorsement of student organizers is for the BNP, plus the BNP has power, so it has the ability to do things like pay them off, especially in this environment that's often what they want, they are unlikely to continue spreading their values or encouraging young people to turn out. Plus, I've explained why young people don't have the capacity to, even if they want to turn out, which is why youth turnout in Bangladesh continues to be low. Third, they say there's a risk of coming out of retirement. I've explained why in the long run, which is the potential time period that they will come out of retirement, one, they have damaged their credibility because they would have made a promise to exit politics, and two, they will not be seen in the same way because memories will be short-lived. All of this means there will not be a meaningful challenge to the power of the BNP. The BNP will crush political competition. Here's the thing, youth leaders will be better than the BNP. Their argument is youth leaders will be totally insulated from political competition, so why do they give a fuck? Here's why. Because youth leaders aren't a monolithic group. The fact that even some youth leaders are potentially ideological faces substantial amounts of pressure, to ensure that basically youth leaders push for democratization and similar norms. Closing? You have anything? Yeah.
Your own argument on why these leaders are non-monolithic is the precise reason why there's likely to remain political competition on our side, given that different factions of the organization movement probably back different parties, including the Islamist parties described at LO.
No, but I've just given you a bunch of reasons why the BNP will beat all these potential parties. In a first-past-the-post system, strategic voting means you always back a single party, and then BNP will act as a shelling point, plus they will use rhetoric to get them in, even if they have differing views. However, if they are in politics, even if they are temporarily a monolith, if one of them starts engaging in democratic backsliding, other youth leaders can turn against them and form parties of their own which can drive political competition, which can help Bangladesh. Here's the argument that they totally missed from Liz's speech. The BNP has strong economic connections with existing textile industries. Textile industries have backed them for a substantial amount of time, so they depend on them for their resources, they owe them favors, they have family members appointed to top positions in a bunch of textile industries that didn't want the Awami League to win. Why does this matter? Because Bangladesh needs to stop industrial policy favoring textile industries. As wages rise in Bangladesh, it can no longer compete with countries like Ethiopia on textiles, plus Bangladesh is in the midst of an emerging market crisis and needs to transition up the value chain in order to grow, and this growth is necessary to do things that create youth unemployment. Even if the BNP cares about the youth, it cares about the funding it gets from corporate backers, which it can use to win way more votes than just the votes of the youth. This means the BNP will be structurally politically corrupt. We fixed that on opening opposition.
Regardless of the virtues of these students, if they pursue their demands, they will damage the legacy to the political program outlined in their 9-point plan, that is bad. What is their political program? A couple of things. Firstly, they want to fire tracts of police, commissioners, and superintendents who are involved in student casualties. Secondly, they want to fire tracts of vice chancellors of universities all across Bangladesh. And thirdly, they want to remove security personnel at large from university campuses in Bangladesh. The first thing I'm going to do here is explain why those political decisions are likely inflexible, and then I will explain why they are bad. And the importance of explaining why they're inflexible is it shows why young people, no thank you, will not kind of be strategic and adopt particular positions in order to avoid the sort of backlash I'll explain later. Why are they inflexible? Well, firstly, I would note that these things are highly public, highly published. They're in the 9-point plan, which I think makes them relatively difficult to walk back because they are a stated ideological commitment of these young people. But secondly, I think that they likely believe them, both ideologically, but also incredibly emotionally, because fundamentally these sorts of demands represent revenge on the kinds of people whose students viewed as being particularly punitive or particularly immoral. That, I think, additionally means that this is likely an expectation of their peers in the movement, making it socially very difficult to avoid. Additionally, though, I would note that the most radical young people are likely to be at the forefront of politics. Those are the people with potentially the most charisma, those are the people with the strongest belief that pushes them into political roles relative to more moderate young people. Finally, I would note they probably have a pretty rational desire to disempower political enemies like vice chancellors, like police. But I'm going to explain now why that is probably a very bad thing. So, young people enter politics with a list of demands about disempowering people like vice chancellors, like police. This, I think, is highly unachievable. I think that this is a set of people who are obviously incredibly empowered in society. They have access to incredibly important institutions like universities, like police, and they are important. Like, obviously, it is important to have police in Bangladesh, and that means I think that they are particularly powerful enemies. And this provides you, I think, a far more specific reason why things like coups or more moderately institutional resistance is inevitable, because the set of people specifically who these young people have upset are the ones who their political program irritates, who are the ones who their political programs continue to provoke. But I would also note that these are very numerous enemies. Like, we're talking not just about powerful people, but about like hundreds, probably thousands of police. These are people who are going to be motivated against these students. Finally, though, I would note that this also alienates you from potential political allies, because I think it's pretty unlikely that, for instance, the BNP is particularly keen on like mass firing security from university campuses. I think a lot of adults are probably pretty like they think security is a good thing to have at a university in some level. I'll take you in a second. All of that, I think, means that young people are likely to suffer in terms of getting traction in achieving their political goals. They're likely to be ineffective, and that, I think, is something which is far more likely to lead to the kind of problems with youth engagement described by both opening teams. I'll take opening now.
If the impact is a coup, the risk of a coup will deter them from pursuing as aggressive as policies as these. If the impact isn't a coup and just they lose political support, they lose the next election, they will abandon these policies.
I already explained why they're likely to be hubristic, why they're likely to be strident and inflexible, but I also just explained why there are a series of less things that aren't coups that are still bad. Things like institutions refusing to cooperate with you, things like potential political allies refusing alliances with you. The next thing I want to explain is that formal politics uniquely leads to division and infighting, which is bad. And I think this is actually kind of conceded by opening opposition, who says, well, it's fine if they become a bit corrupt because they can just condemn their peers. Formal politics is more divisive than civil society, firstly, because you are required to take far more specific political positions, which opens up far more ground to disagree with each other, to have petty differences. Secondly, politics is competitive and zero-sum. You're likely running against each other in things like pre-selections, and it's the kind of personalities that are trying to gain notoriety, trying to gain media coverage. Thirdly, I would note that these are likely people with reputations as firebrands. They want to prove it by holding those around them accountable, by being particularly vitriolic in discussions. Why is this division so bad? It's the quickest route to absolutely destroy the credibility of this student movement. You require like one incredibly public spat to make people distrust these leaders, to make them, to be more skeptical of them. Secondly, it splits the movement all the way down because the peers, the people who follow these leaders, are likely to want to pick sides. And thirdly, it obviously just has an opportunity cost to becoming a far more unifying civil society leader. I'm going to weigh civil society here because I think opening government is a bit vague about what civil society figures can actually achieve. Why is civil society important? Firstly, it's far more accessible. Opening opposition tells you it's incredibly hard to vote in elections. There are an enormous number of barriers. But things like social media, things like accessing media are incredibly inclusive and allow people to participate in politics far more easily. It's important to be there. But secondly, civil society is more resilient. It is harder to crack down on civil society figures because they're perceived as less political, because it's opposed by international actors, which means it's important to seize your notoriety to be in these civil society figures, a place where it is important to have powerful individuals. We think that politics is probably already covered by individuals being motivated to vote, caring about politics in a historically unique way. Proud.
Sorry, could I please run out of the room just for this speech so I can get my bag? Yeah, sure. Or, I mean, if I can come back in time, it would be even better. Oh, no, wait, never mind.
Yay!
I was literally saying
That was really fast.
We thank the speaker very much for their speech, and we now welcome the member of opposition to give the first update.
Firstly, on the future political system of Bangladesh. Secondly, on stability and why the BNP would be bad for it, as well as incredibly bad governance. Let's start with the future political system of Bangladesh, because we think the biggest football in this debate isn't about who wins government the next time, because what's happening at the moment is we have an interim government, and before we go to another general election, they're going to have an election before that to form a special assembly to rewrite the Bangladeshi constitution and reform the government institutions of that country. And the most important thing in this debate is who has power in that to form the long-term constitution of Bangladesh, what the formation of government is going to look like. And that very intuitively outweighs the rest of the debate. So they're talking about all of the governance structures that inform every single election into the future. What are the problems with Bangladesh's political system at the moment? First of all, the massive rigging of elections. What was supposed to happen is that the government prior to an election would give up power to a caretaker government such that they weren't in power during that election so that they couldn't rig it. The Awami League refused to do that, and that's why the BNP boycotted almost every election in the last decade. So, secondly, there's an enormous amount of corruption in Bangladeshi government. That's to say, there's an enormous amount of embezzlement, an enormous amount of people who are appointed bureaucrats who continue to preserve their own ends. There's also an enormous amount of judicial problems. Members of the judiciary essentially act in line with political parties. All of them were first to mass resign and protest because they were trying to bring back Sheikh Hasina after she had fled to India. There's an enormous amount of problems that need to be solved in this constitutional assembly, and currently the interim government has established a large number of commissions under Mohammed Hassan and also with the involvement of the student leaders to reform these problems. Why is it gay?
Yunus has a Nobel Prize. Do you think that the international actors are likely to want to negotiate with him or a university student?
Hassan isn't going to run in the next election, to be clear. He's coming a caretaker, which is what he did in the last caretaker election about 20 years ago. But he's very explicitly a caretaker. He's not here to be a long-term political actor in Bangladesh. So, why is it that it is necessary to have these people involved in the Constitutional Assembly? First of all, the existing forces in politics benefited from each of these systems. All of their allies, they were put in place by the existing political system, so they're incredibly unlikely to want to change it. But secondly, without a specifically large institutional force against this, it's likely that any smaller forces that OG talks about, like individuals or small groups of 2 or 3 running, would be able to get this change through. They're likely to be bought off or horse traded by the larger parties. They're less likely to have an agreement on what this reform should look like, so even if they all agree there should be reform, if they don't agree on it, they're on net going to get outvoted. And also, they weren't involved in the creation of it. The student leaders got Mohammed Hassan in, they served in roles with those commissions developing it, so they are the ones who's involved in the development and can get it passed through. Why is it that they can only get this done if they are a party? First of all, being a part of a party is necessary for branding and selling your candidates. And secondly, like elections is big business. You need operatives, you need money, you need ads, you need institutional capacity. You can't do this as a set of 2 or 3 individuals. The next thing I want to prove is that other institutional power in Bangladesh is very, very rare. Because they keep on going to other institutions we might support. But there's good, and I asked them to name one, which they can't, but there's good structural reasons to believe there aren't a lot of other large institutions in Bangladesh that could form themselves into political parties. First of all, it was an authoritarian country. Secondly, the Awami, which meant that obviously they were trying to shut down any alternative institutional power base. Secondly, the Awami League tried to position itself as a big tent party that could include anyone in, so they had an incentive to try and bring in any other institutions and align themselves with the Awami League. And thirdly, Bangladesh has been in chaos for many years. The initial protests against the quota system started in 2018, and in that context of chaos, it's very difficult to form institutional power. So that means that there aren't a lot of other large institutions that could step into this gap. The best comparative then is the BNP or other smaller parties. Opening government says, well, students are seen as bad, they're seen as irrational, they're seen as too young. But the problem with this is that this party isn't just going to run students, they're going to bring other people in. For instance, they brought in Hassan in the short run. Also, they brought in a large number of university professors who actually designed the original system of reform. They worked with their own professors. And military leaders, as opening opposition points out, military leaders who told the military to put down their arms, not to oppose this. And those people have almost nothing in common, except for the fact that they were brought together by anti-discrimination students movement. That is why they're likely to be taken seriously. And that also rebuts a closing government who's like, well, they're incredibly terrible, but they've brought in a large amount of support. The key thing is that they are important for bringing those people together. I also want to note here, not only is it important that they're part of the Constitutional Assembly to solve all those problems, but it's also important that they are the first government afterwards. Because as I alluded to, the entire Supreme Court of Bangladesh was forced to resign because they were seen as trying to bring back Sheikh Hasina. That means that they're going to get to appoint the next set of justices who will make the first interpretations of the new constitution that will serve as the baseline precedent against which that constitution is interpreted. And that's incredibly important. They also set the norms of how it's interpreted. And if another party wins, they have an incentive to show that the new rules that they don't like are very bad and very difficult in order to manufacture consent to get them taken away. It's very important that they are not only involved in the writing of it, but that they are the first party to interpret it and to appoint the justices who do so. What are the benefits of this? It means that you get a government that functions, which is important for your economics, but also means you get rid of the quota system, right? Which is not only unmeritocratic, but also incredibly bad for the functioning of government because you appoint a large number of freedom fighters to the system not because they're good. And it makes, and crucially, it makes the Bangladeshi public service not politically neutral because the freedom fighters that are appointed have political allegiances, and it means that you don't have a neutral public service. That pretty much weighs pretty intuitively over the rest of the debate. Second extension. Why is it that you get more stability? Opening government says you will get the military coup. Opening opposition pretty astutely points out that the military explicitly allowed them to come through. You're very unlikely to get a military coup. Why is it that the BNP would be incredibly bad for stability? First of all, their leader is not clear he can legitimately run. He's in charge of anti-corruption, and different courts are split over his actual legitimacy as a candidate. So that means that there's incredibly likely to be protests. Secondly, there's very likely to be Hindu protests when this aggressively pro-Muslim party wins, who has done terrible things to Hindu minorities in the past. And thirdly, your relationship with India is likely to be substantially worse, and they're likely to foment unrest on the ground. We already saw Indian forces in the country protecting Sheikh Hasina on her side during the last revolution, and they have an incentive to foment chaos in the country in order to re-establish their influence. And I'll note, these aren't only reasons why you don't get stability. There are also reasons why the BNP is bad. Like, they are anti-Hindu, we should care about Hindu. They are anti-India, we should care about your relationship with India, your trade relationship, your security relationship. They have done corruption, which is not only the reason you can't legitimately run, but also, corruption is bad. Additionally, I think it's important that these student leaders are there to be able to tamp down protest. Opening opposition says, well, the student leaders might do protest, but I think that's the lower impact argument, because their protests on net have been pretty good and pretty reasonable. What's more important is the bad, more aggressive sets of protests that might come from other actors, which we think they're uniquely good at tamping down and stopping becoming violent. First of all, people will feel lied to if these people don't follow through on their promises. Secondly, they are powerful figures who can come out persuasively and urge people to tamp down. But thirdly, the protests are more willing to negotiate with them when they're in government because they have a history of being receptive to protest rather than turning to violence because they feel the government will never listen because protests will never work.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech. Now I welcome the government whip to pull over government bench here.
government wins the debate, and secondly, why the opposition bench loses. Firstly, why did we win the debate? I think we make kind of two contributions. The first is just explaining in substantial detail why these student leaders would be both bad at politics, but also, perhaps more importantly, good at civil society, and impacting why that is a society and politics changing force. And the second, I think, is just outlining that most of the specific demands of the anti-discrimination student movement in their highly publicized 9-point plan, published like after deposing Hasina, are bad. And of course, as this team might respond, some of those demands are like fine, for instance, asking for compensation for families of protesters who were killed. That's fine. But those kind of demands are not sensationalist, nor are they radical. They're extremely unlikely to be the focus of campaigns, of opposition, of media, of the things that they are held to by political opponents, and that are indeed in the spotlight in the media at the moment. Many of those demands are incredibly bad. Things like firing huge tracts of police who are related to the universities or whose jurisdiction was the universities where protests were suppressed, even if those police were not directly involved, like they didn't kill a person, they just have jurisdiction over those universities. No security in universities, firing huge tracts of VCs, a national ban on the Awami League unit wing. And I think those policies are bad in a few respects. Firstly, I would oppose many of them on face value on their grounds alone. For instance, I don't think you should ban student movements of most political parties until they pass an extremely high threshold. I think that is probably something we should be conservative about, not restricting free speech. I think police who are often underpaid, who are not personally responsible for violence against students, who happen to be part of an systemically corrupt institution but don't have much choice in that, should not be fired from their jobs. I think those are immoral demands and we should not stand for them. Secondly, those demands are literally impossible to fulfill. As Ellie points out to no response, you have powerful enemies in the form of the whole police force. This is incredibly scary. This doesn't work, which at very worst for us is just an enormous opportunity cost of resources, a failure to get your policies passed. But also I know it's incredibly embarrassing and delegitimizing for these student protesters and for all the civil society organizations and movements that we point that they're attached to, where they can do good work out of politics. Maybe, for instance, you want to go into politics later, you can't because you have an initial track record of doing terrible things and failing to pass through a policy. The response we get to this from opening opposition in a POI is, firstly, well, if there's a risk of coup, then you moderate. I think Ellie preempts this in quite a lot of detail. We explained that you aren't rational, that it's very unlikely that there's a risk of a coup on their side. You're not thinking about the future in that extent, that it's incredibly embarrassing and maybe, for instance, risks backlash or political violence in the short term to backtrack on your established demands. And importantly, even if some people are rational in this way, the most prominent leaders of that movement will not be. The second claim they make is, well, if you don't moderate, you're going to lose the election. But firstly, I would note that harms the movement of anti-authoritarian student protesters regardless. Even if it's true that you lose the election by having these demands, it still hurts that movement. It hurts, for instance, initial movements by students, any student in Bangladesh, against corruption, against authoritarianism in the future. They are tarred with that brush, which it is incredibly easy for opposition parties and media outlets to pick up on. But secondly, maybe at the very best, this claim hurts OG, but it doesn't hurt us, because we explain why involvement in civil society matters, and importantly, you can also run more successfully for politics later, for instance. You can run more successfully for politics later if you're not tarred with this brush. If, for instance, you have demands that are bad, that means that you can't operate in civil society as well. But finally, I think some people probably still do win, and I wonder that even if you only get one politician representing this constituency in Parliament, you cause huge amounts of chaos. You shift the Overton window. You mean that people discredit other, more sensible left-wing policies like restrictions on police powers. You mean that there's gridlock in Parliament. All of that is terrible. Why does this then get us above opening government? I think it presents a fairly generic criticism of young left revolutionaries on the basis of their radicalism, but also the tempting vices of politics like corruption. But the problem with this is, firstly, claims in terms of enticement to corruption, while true, I think seem relatively symmetric, given the features that this team themselves point out in terms of the political system in Bangladesh at large. But secondly, radicalism, of course, as our opening says, can be bad, but can also be good, right? Like deeply radical movements, like for instance, anti-caste movements or feminism, are both good ideologically, but are deeply attractive to people, even though they ask for very large changes to the status quo. We explain that the changes we're asking for are bad, which means they're both unpopular, but also undesirable. But finally, we impact the alternative. Civil society, not just politics, which makes society and makes government better. We win. Let's now talk about opening opposition. Opening opposition, I think, is dangerously pessimistic in their vision of the status quo. They say the BNP will have no political competition without students to push back. The reason for this is because it's prohibitively hard for the youth to vote. The BNP receives money from lobbyists. They'll always get young people on side. young people on sides students don't win. This is dangerous because it's a self-defeating argument for opening opposition. If the BNP is so powerful, then students contesting elections will fail regardless. And then one attempt to bridge this gap is to say, well, people care a lot about the youth and revolution now, we have to take that opportunity. That is insufficient for a few reasons. Firstly, it could lost that momentum, right? Like if you present yourself as political critics, part of civil society, it is likely that anti-authoritarian momentum lost. But secondly, if opening opposition is right, there is an appetite for change. That doesn't mean there's an appetite for supporting this specific political party, especially because their power is in opposing the AL, not in creating and endorsing their own political platform, which I know requires many different skills and virtues. Finally, they say the BNP has a textile contract which is bad. One, this is self-correcting. Yes, lobbying is powerful, but votes matter from individual people whose wages are going down. There are other competing businesses that don't like cronyistic contracts expire. Or secondly, if the textile industry is so cemented, and then that means that other parties who are established also need money, also take that money. Finally, let's rebut closing opposition. Firstly, they say that young people in politics will help the future political system in terms of the changes to the constitution. One, it's unlikely that those young people are elected or listened to if they are elected for the reasons we give. They don't have the ads or the institutional capacity that this team describes as necessary. That is overpowering. Secondly, Yunus has decreased corruption massively, and it's likely that his oversight as the caretaker government will make sure that the special assembly is good, that it's not done corruptly, and so on. But finally, they say, well, the students have united lots of different parts of society. That's true with regards to taking down the AL. It is not true with regards to rewriting the constitution, where people have hugely different interests if you are the military as opposed to if you are students. They say next that the BNP will fail. Firstly, nice of your opening who says they're guaranteed success no matter what. But secondly, the barriers they put up are transitory. They say the leader is bad, you get a new one. Again, Yunus has massively decreased corruption in Bangladesh. They say your relationship with India is bad. I'll flip that. It's way worse because India hated the student protesters, sent on police to target them and bring them down. This ruins your relationship with India, or rather hurts it, because obviously India doesn't like the student protesters. It doesn't like it when the Special Assembly supports them and has them in their midst.
Close off debate. Here.
Firstly, closing government and opening government, the weighing against opening government. Opening opposition will be integrated and mainly intuitive. Firstly, in closing government, we're going to ask two questions. Firstly, will the youth leaders win elections? And secondly, are policies they're going to implement when they win, good or bad? Firstly, on youth leaders and whether they'll win elections. The first reason why I think this is pretty obvious, that we explained, is that they have already proven themselves to be highly effective political organisers. This seems dismissive about the amount of effort required, is that protests took place over a long period of time and involved more than just organising people on the streets, but organising highly complex networks of people to operate around an infrastructure system that cracked down on those students, and then after that being able to negotiate the process of establishing a relatively democratic transitional government in order to manage the process of moving towards democracy, and establishing a series of commissions in order to deal with and analyse the problems that existed in the previous system, which could suggest to you that these protesters are efficient at organising, are likely to be good at winning elections. Secondly, we think the BNP themselves have lost a lot of institutional knowledge without winning elections, which means that whilst they are probably likely to be effective, they are unlikely to be unbeatable. That is, firstly, because they've been disempowered by the Army League, they've been in long-term opposition for decades, which suggests they haven't had that much infrastructure around winning elections. But Secondly, and additionally, they've boycotted elections for a long period of time, which means that infrastructure around elections is likely to be lost. Now, we can sort of deny opening opposition. We agree with opening opposition that in the counterfactual, without students, it's likely that this BNP is going to win the election without student opposition. What Matt says is not that is never going to happen, but that if it did happen, it would be bad because the BNP is a lawful party. Thirdly, their unpopular policies are outweighed by a series of very popular features that is firstly coming from outside the establishment, because I'll note, whilst it's true that people have some skepticism of students and whether or not they'll be anti-democratic, they know for certain that the BNP has been corrupt. It's led by a person who is currently being charged for money laundering. It has previous experience or has been previously called out for corruption, which guarantees them some amount of leverage over them. Secondly, the people in Bangladesh want democracy. Living in a dictatorship sucks. Having at least one party that is working hard towards democracy is a meaningful draw for people, even if they have a series of unpopular policies. Thirdly, the students aren't a super racialized religious party, which is a characteristic of the BNP that has alienated a lot of people in Bangladesh who see that racialization as something that causes division, escalates tensions in the region of India, and is detrimental towards the likelihood of getting trade and economic development in the future. Fourthly and finally, they're not children. These are university students as well, pretty old university students who have been politically organizing for a long time, who are experienced in some level of politics at the youth level. We think these people are likely to be sophisticated. Let's do some weighing. Sophie says it won't work. This is obviously going to be a hard thing to achieve, but now is the best time to achieve it of any time in the future. The Awami League is split, the Awami League is on the run, and their leader has left India. They like a firm alternative towards the leader, someone who can organize them. The students have a lot of momentum at the moment, and the BNP is at a critical point where it is also unlikely to succeed for the reasons that I previously explained about lacking the infrastructure around elections to win. So now is the only time when it could work, and that's when it's important. So weighing around the likelihood then. Firstly, I think we do prove high likelihood of success. In fact, this is conceded by Prime Minister, who claims that they will be so popular and unbeatable, they will have unchecked power that results in them becoming evil, which is therefore makes opposing government a knife for open government as well. But secondly, even if they don't, it's still good for them to have some level of power. Firstly, because it means better accountability on the BNP and the Awami League if they are the ones who end up in power. But secondly, it's important for building momentum towards future political successes as you build institutional knowledge around elections into and towards the future. Next, let's then talk about whether or not their policies are bad. They outline that some of these policies might have negative consequences. Firstly, many of the people who they want to remove from power are extremely unpopular. For example, police commissioners in Bangladesh are notorious for being dismissive of things like police officers engaging in violence, engaging in rape. They are people who others also want to see removed. Secondly, it's often necessary to remove these figures in order to remove corruption. A lot of these people are aligned with corrupt political figures from the Awami League, which makes removing them necessary in order to remove the infrastructure that allows corruption to continue. Because even if you change who's in power, the BNP comes in power, if you permit the lower levels of corruption to continue to permeate the system, the BNP then becomes the corrupt political party that's in power. Thirdly, it's necessary to get trust in government. As a result of the aforementioned problems, the fact that they are corrupt, and the fact that they are associated with previous members of the Awami League, and the fact that they're unpopular, if you want trust in any new government, it needs to remove the infrastructure of the old government, which is unpopular and evil. Fourthly, and most importantly, it's important for justice. These people are evil people who deserve punishment. The Student League, Sophie wants to say, is a fucking terrorist organization. The Awami League's youth group should be disseminated and destroyed. They are a group of people who deserve justice to come to them. Could these youth leaders finally then be flexible, even in the instances where these policies are bad? Firstly, they have explicitly, I'll take in a moment, set up a series of commissions to redesign their policy platform with experts involved. That legitimizes changes and refinement that occur of policy, not as backflips, but on academic refinement on the policies they have established, which makes that change legitimate. But secondly, they're likely to believe in that flexibility and not be so hegemonic in view because they're working with a new set of people. They're working with people like Hassan, the interim leader of the government, like the figures and academics they have put into these commissions in order to redefine their policy. They have a revealed preference towards redefining and establishing a new political platform that is likely to have positive outcomes, even in the examples where their policies are badly get fixed. Okay.
15 seconds. OT already gave 5 reasons the BNP is accountable. Students are a newly energized voting. One, they will riot if the BNP breaks the court. The BNP must satisfy protesters' demands to deter politicians from entering. They can still operate outside politics, and the BNP needs to prove it has changed from the past. This beats your extension directly.
It doesn't. Allowing BNP to come into power at a moment of unique political vacuum and crisis and high instability with a system of corruption already in place means that none of those systems of democratic ability exist. They might have potential pressure from young people or from other political parties, but if they rig the next election, and after this next election then they win, they don't get any of those better outcomes. But if you believe that's true, and the BNP should have accountability, they get better accountability when there is more youth representation in Parliament. Next, to respond to opening government, first they say this is going to empower parties that weaponize skepticism that people have for student leaders. Firstly, directly contradicted by their later claim, which is that student leaders will be so popular they will end up having unchecked power. Secondly, these people are likely to be skeptical of anyone who takes in the branding of being the consequence of the revolutionary movement. Next, they say that student leaders will have too much unchecked power and will become corrupt in the end. Firstly, if there's any meaningful degree of skepticism, that explains where the democratic ability on student leaders comes from. Like, if you believe the BNP is likely to be successful, or at least like pushback, like they say, usually that is the pressure that forces them to continue to be democratic, because there is someone calling them out and forcing them to be better. How are they likely to go about getting their legitimacy? Firstly, doing the things they set out to, like abolishing the quota system, which only Matt explains the real harm of. Secondly, getting the backing and approval of various groups who supported them in the process of the revolution, like university academics and the commissions they've set up. Thirdly, maintaining their commitment to democracy into the long term. So if you believe that the BNP is a meaningful opposition, that explains why youth leaders will continue to be good long term if they do win. Finally, they think that the BNP win, that's good. The BNP is horrible. Firstly, they're horrible, they can do minorities. Secondly, they're led by a corrupt person. Thirdly, they bring anti-union, which will likely escalate regional tensions. But also, better competition makes the BNP better, so if you believe they're going to win, have more youth.